In a small village in Portugal called Aljustrel, belonging to the parish of Fatima, two children were born who would be witnesses to one of the most extraordinary events in the history of the Church. Francisco Marto came into the world on June 11th, 1908, and his sister Jacinta Marto was born on March 11th, 1910. Both were children of Manuel Pedro Marto and Olimpia de Jesus, a humble but deeply Christian family. From a young age, Francisco and Jacinta showed great simplicity and purity of heart. Together with their cousin Lucia dos Santos, they spent their days shepherding the family's sheep. In those verdant fields, surrounded by the beauty of God's creation, they played, prayed, and lived the innocence of childhood, never imagining the divine designs that were about to be revealed to them. In the year 1916, before the famous apparitions of Our Lady, the three children received mysterious visits from a heavenly being who would later be identified as the Angel of Portugal or the Angel of Peace. This angel prepared them spiritually for what was to come, teaching them prayers of adoration and sacrifice to God for sinners. The angel appeared to them 3 times, asking for penance and urging them to pray constantly. On one of those occasions, he miraculously gave them the Holy Eucharist, teaching them that Jesus was present in the consecrated host. These experiences left a profound mark on Francisco and Jacinta and strengthened in them the desire to offer sacrifices in reparation for the sins of the world. Finally, on May 13th, 1917, while they were shepherding their sheep in the Cova da Iria, an intense light enveloped them. In the midst of that light, a lady dressed in white, brighter than the sun, appeared. It was the Virgin Mary, who would speak to them for 6 consecutive months, always on the 13th, bringing messages of conversion, penance, and prayer. Our Lady asked the children to pray the rosary every day for world peace and for the conversion of sinners. Francisco and Jacinta took this request seriously, devoting themselves to prayer with great fervor. Even at such a young age, they understood the importance of interceding for others and offering sacrifices out of love for God and humanity. Among the messages revealed was the terrible fate of sinners who turned away from God. On July 13th, Our Lady showed them a vision of hell, where souls fell like embers amid indescribable torments. This vision had a great impact on the children, especially on Jacinta, who began to weep and pray even more intensely for sinners. Francisco, for his part, developed a deep desire to console the heart of Jesus, saddened by the sins of humanity. He often withdrew to pray in silence, contemplating God and offering him his small sacrifices. His love for the Eucharist grew to the point that he wished to spend hours in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament. Our Lady also entrusted them with a secret divided into 3 parts, known as the Secret of Fatima. It included the vision of hell, the announcement of a great war if the world did not convert, and a revelation regarding the future of the Church. These secrets, especially the vision of hell, caused Jacinta and Francisco to devote themselves even more to the mission of saving souls. Though they were only children, their spiritual maturity was impressive. They began to practice mortifications, fasting, and wearing tight cords around their bodies as penance. They suffered joyfully, knowing that their sacrifices helped convert sinners. News of the apparitions soon spread, drawing crowds to the Cova da Iria. Many believed, but there were also skeptics who ridiculed and persecuted the children. They were even imprisoned and threatened to make them deny the apparitions, but they stood firm, preferring to suffer rather than renounce the truth of what they had seen and heard. On October 13, 1917, in the presence of about 70,000 people, the great miracle of the sun took place. The sun spun in the sky, changed colors, and seemed to hurl itself toward the earth, causing panic among those present. This miracle was a divine sign confirming the apparitions, and many converted on witnessing God's power manifested through those humble children. After the apparitions, Francisco and Jacinta continued their lives with the same fervor. Francisco intensified his prayer life, spending hours adoring God. Jacinta, in turn, became even more dedicated to penance, offering all her sufferings out of love for Our Lady and for sinners. Shortly thereafter, a terrible Spanish flu epidemic devastated Portugal. Francisco and Jacinta fell gravely ill, seeing in their illness an opportunity to offer even more sacrifices to God. Francisco, always serene, said that he would soon go to heaven and that he wished to see Jesus and Our Lady. On April 4th, 1919, Francisco departed for eternity at just 10 years of age. He died a holy death after receiving Holy Communion, which he had so desired. Although brief, his life was filled with love for God, making him an example of purity and total surrender to the divine will. Jacinta, though very weakened, still had the strength to suffer out of love. She was taken to a hospital in Lisbon, where she endured great pain without complaining. She knew she was offering her life for the salvation of souls, especially for the sinners who most offended God. Our Lady appeared to Jacinta a few times, revealing truths about the future of humanity and the Pope's suffering. She asked that people pray much for the Holy Father and for the conversion of mankind. On February 20th, 1920, Jacinta died alone in the hospital, as Our Lady had foretold. Her death was a true act of love, for she accepted everything patiently, uniting herself to Christ's sufferings for the redemption of the world. Francisco and Jacinta were buried in Fatima and became objects of great popular devotion. Many graces and miracles began to be attributed to their intercession, leading the Church to recognize their heroic virtues. The process of beatification began years later, and on May 13, 2000, St. John Paul II proclaimed them blessed. The recognition of their holiness was a moment of great joy for the faithful, especially for those who had witnessed their short but luminous time on earth. Finally, on May 13, 2017, on the centenary of the apparitions, Pope Francis canonized them, making them the youngest non-martyr saints in the history of the Church. Their example of faith, sacrifice, and love for God continues to inspire millions of people around the world. The message of Fatima, of which Francisco and Jacinta were bearers, remains current. The call to conversion, to praying the rosary, and to reparation for sins still resonates as an urgent appeal to all humanity. In Fatima, the sanctuary dedicated to Our Lady has become one of the largest centers of pilgrimage in the world. Millions of faithful visit each year, seeking the intercession of the Virgin Mary and of the little shepherd saints. Francisco and Jacinta, even with their short lives, showed that holiness has no age. Their story is a testimony that God can accomplish great things through the small, as long as they surrender themselves entirely to Him. May we follow the example of these holy little shepherds, living with simplicity, love and devotion to God, always attentive to the call of the Virgin Mary to conversion and prayer. The lives of Saints Francisco and Jacinta Marto are a testimony that holiness does not require age, wealth, or earthly greatness, but rather a heart entirely given to God. These little shepherds of Fatima teach us that faith and prayer can transform the world and bring souls closer to God. From the time of the apparitions, Francisco became deeply contemplative. His greatest desire was to console God, so offended by humanity's sins. He spent long hours in silence, withdrawing even from play to pray. His simplicity was the expression of a soul that found its happiness in the divine presence. Jacinta, on the other hand, had a burning zeal for souls. The vision of hell marked her deeply, and she did not want anyone to suffer that fate. Her heart overflowed with compassion for sinners, and so she intensified her sacrifices, offering everything to God for the conversion of the world. On one occasion, Jacinta asked Francisco, "What did you like more, seeing the angel or Our Lady?" Francisco replied, "I liked seeing Our Lady more, but I liked even more seeing God in that light that she placed in our hearts." This dialogue shows the depth of the children's spirituality and how much they already understood of God's greatness. During the months following the apparitions, the two siblings lived with a very clear sense of mission. They understood they had a special calling and that their lives, even if short, should be entirely dedicated to fulfilling God's will. Francisco said that when he died, he would go to heaven and there console Jesus. He spoke with such certainty about his going to paradise that his family and friends were astonished. His faith was simple yet firm, and he was confident in the promise Our Lady had made to them. Jacinta, despite being the youngest, showed impressive maturity. Her love for the Pope and for sinners was immense. She often said, "We have to pray a lot for the Holy Father. He suffers a lot." Her words seemed prophetic, anticipating difficult times for the Church. When the Spanish flu epidemic reached Portugal, Francisco was one of the first to become ill. He accepted his illness serenely, saying he was happy to be able to suffer for the love of Jesus. He refused medicine and comforts, for he wished to offer everything as a sacrifice. Despite his fever and weakness, Francisco did not complain. His only concern was to receive communion before he died. Since he had never made his first communion, he asked a priest to bring him Jesus. When he finally received the Eucharist, his joy was immense. Shortly thereafter, on April 4, 1919, Francisco died peacefully at home, surrounded by his family. He passed into eternity with a smile on his lips, as if he were already beholding the glory of God. Jacinta suffered even more. Her illness was prolonged and painful, but she endured everything patiently. She always said, "I love our Lord and Our Lady so much that I never tire of saying I love them." Her words reflected her deep union with God. The little shepherd had to be transferred to a hospital where she was far from her family. Our Lady had already told her that she would die alone, and she accepted that destiny as a great sacrifice offered out of love. In Lisbon, where she was admitted, Jacinta had visions and revelations about the future. She said that many fashions would come and offend God, and that many wars would happen because people were not converting. Her words were an urgent call to penance and prayer. One of the nurses at the hospital testified that Jacinta bore everything with great courage. Even as she suffered, she smiled and said she wanted to save many souls. Her strength came from her unshakable faith and her trust in the promises of Our Lady. On February 20th, 1920, Jacinta died alone in the hospital, as Our Lady had said. Her death was a true act of surrender, and her soul was certainly received by God and by Our Lady in heaven. The impact of the two shepherds' deaths was immense. The story of the Fatima apparitions had already spread, and many pilgrims began to visit the Cova da Iria to pray and ask for the children's intercession. Over the years, countless miracles have been attributed to the intercession of Francisco and Jacinta. People from all over the world reported healings and graces received after praying to the little shepherd saints. The official recognition of their holiness began with the opening of the beatification process. The Church examined their lives and found that they had heroically lived the Christian virtues even though they were so young. On May 13, 2000, during a solemn celebration in Fatima, Pope St. John Paul II beatified Francisco and Jacinta. It was a moment of great emotion for all devotees of the message of Fatima. The miracle that led to their canonization took place in 2013, when a Brazilian child was healed of a serious illness after the shepherd's intercession. The cure was recognized by the Church as a true miracle. On May 13, 2017, during the centennial celebrations of the apparitions, Pope Francis canonized Francisco and Jacinta Marto, officially declaring them saints of the Church. The canonization was a historic event, as they became the youngest non-martyr saints in the Church. This reinforces the message that holiness does not depend on age, but on love for God and on doing His will. The sanctuary of Fatima remains one of the largest pilgrimage centers in the world, where millions of faithful seek the intercession of Our Lady and the Little Shepherd Saints. The message of Fatima, conveyed by Francisco and Jacinta, is an ongoing call to prayer, penance, and conversion. In times of spiritual crisis, their lives are a beacon of hope for all Christians. May we follow the example of these little shepherd saints, living with simplicity, love, and devotion to God, always attentive to the call of Our Lady. The holiness of Francisco and Jacinta Marto is a testimony of God's action in the lives of those who, even in childhood, are docile to His will. Their lives were brief but deeply marked by love for God, by prayer, and by sacrifices offered for sinners. After the canonization of the Little Shepherds, devotion to them increased even more around the world. Churches, schools, and communities began to invoke their intercession, recognizing them as models of faith and total surrender to God's will. Francisco's spirituality centered on contemplation. Above all, he wanted to console the heart of Jesus and remain in deep union with God. His life was a constant act of reparation for the sins of the world, lived with simplicity and love. Jacinta, for her part, lived her spirituality in a more active way, concerned about sinners and the Pope's suffering. Her words and actions showed extraordinary compassion, typical of souls that have reached a high degree of holiness. Jacinta's example teaches us the importance of praying for others. Her great concern was to prevent souls from being lost. Even at a young age, she understood the value of sacrifice united with Christ's cross, offering her pain for sinners' conversion. Francisco shows us the beauty of silent adoration. He loved to be alone with God, contemplating His greatness and offering Him all His love. Today, his example reminds us of the importance of contemplative prayer and adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. The two siblings lived a holy childhood, proving that holiness is not reserved only for adults or for those in religious life. Holiness is a universal call, and God can accomplish great things even in His smallest children. Francisco and Jacinta's mission did not end with their deaths. Even today, their intercession is powerful, and many faithful report graces received after asking for help from these little shepherd saints. Their witness remains alive in the Church. Pope St. John Paul II had a special connection with Fatima and the Little Shepherds. He believed that Our Lady of Fatima had saved him from the assassination attempt on May 13, 1981, precisely on the day of the apparitions. As a sign of gratitude, John Paul II made a point of visiting Fatima and beatifying Francisco and Jacinta in 2000. He also sent the bullet that struck him to be placed in the crown of the image of Our Lady of Fatima. This link between the attack and the Fatima message further emphasized the importance of the Little Shepherds in the history of the Church. Their mission of calling the world to conversion and prayer remains more relevant than ever. The third part of The Secret of Fatima, officially revealed in 2000, described a symbolic vision of a persecuted church and of the Pope's suffering, something that Jacinta had already sensed in her words about the Holy Father. The call to penance and prayer made by Our Lady through the Little Shepherds was not just for the 20th century, but remains valid today. The world still needs conversion, and the message of Fatima remains an urgent appeal to humanity. The Church recognizes the importance of the Fatima message and encourages the faithful to practice what Our Lady requested: daily recitation of the Rosary, devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and the practice of the 5 first Saturdays of reparation. Francisco and Jacinta, with their simplicity, show us that holiness is within everyone's reach. It is not necessary to carry out great deeds or live a long life to please God. All that is needed is to live with love, surrender, and faithfulness to the gospel. In her prayers, Jacinta always asked for the conversion of sinners. She understood that each soul is precious to God and that sacrifice and prayer could rescue those who had strayed from the faith. Francisco, on the other hand, liked to withdraw to pray alone. He felt a deep need to be in God's presence, and his life of prayer teaches us the importance of silence and contemplation. Both siblings had a profound love for the Eucharist. Francisco wanted to be near Jesus in the tabernacle, and Jacinta lamented that not everyone recognized the value of Holy Mass and communion. After their deaths, their remains were transferred to the Basilica of Our Lady of the Rosary at the Sanctuary of Fatima, where they rest to this day. Thousands of pilgrims visit their tombs each year to honor them and request their intercession. Devotion to the little shepherd saints spread worldwide, and many children are inspired by them to live a holy life from an early age. Catholic schools teach their story, encouraging the young to follow their examples of prayer and sacrifice. In times of moral and spiritual crisis, Francisco and Jacinta are models for youth, showing that it is possible to live for God even in a world that often turns away from Him. The example of the little shepherd saints also teaches us the importance of Marian devotion. They were chosen by Our Lady to deliver a message to the world, and their obedience inspires us to trust more in Mary and follow her requests. Jacinta always said that if she could, she would tell everyone about the suffering of sinners and the need to convert. Her desire to save souls was so intense that even in her final days, in the hospital, she spoke about the importance of prayer. Francisco reminds us that God desires a personal relationship with each of us. His wish to be alone to pray and adore shows that true happiness is found in intimacy with God. The story of Fatima and the little shepherds is one of the greatest 20th century testimonies of divine mercy. God chose 3 humble children to warn the world about the need for conversion and penance. The story of Saints Francisco and Jacinta Marto continues to resonate in the hearts of the faithful, as their mission to pray for sinners and offer sacrifices for the world's conversion did not end with their deaths. Their testimony remains a constant call to prayer and penance. Our Lady entrusted the little shepherds with a message of extreme importance for the future of humanity. The requests she made at the Cova da Iria were not just for the 20th century, but for every generation, for the need for conversion is ongoing. Francisco and Jacinta did not hesitate to respond to that divine call. Even though they were so young, they understood the value of suffering offered out of love for God. Their lives were a testimony that every small sacrifice can be transformed into an act of love and reparation. The shepherds' childhood was abruptly interrupted by the mission given to them, but far from lamenting the loss of a normal life, they joyfully embraced their vocation to holiness. Their spiritual maturity was remarkable and worthy of admiration. Many times, Jacinta displayed a wisdom that seemed supernatural. Her concern for the perdition of souls, for the Pope's suffering, and for people turning away from God revealed a deep understanding of spiritual reality. Francisco, in turn, showed a unique sensitivity toward God. His constant desire was to be in the presence of the Lord, and his greatest sorrow was knowing that Jesus was offended by humanity's sins. The Church recognized the greatness of these small saints and presented them as examples for all humanity. Their story shows that God can accomplish great things through the little and the humble. The sanctuary of Fatima, where the mortal remains of Francisco and Jacinta rest, became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the world. Millions of faithful visit the site each year to pray and seek their intercession. Devotion to the little shepherd saints spread throughout the world. Many families and children are inspired by their example to live a deeper faith, based on prayer and surrender to God. Francisco and Jacinta teach us that holiness is not reserved for a chosen few, but is a universal call. They show that anyone, regardless of age, can achieve holiness if they live with love and faithfulness to God. The message of Fatima is still current. Our Lady's request for the world to convert and pray the Rosary daily is a call that resonates urgently, especially in times of spiritual crisis. The daily prayer of the Rosary was a practice of the little shepherds, and Our Lady reinforced its importance during the apparitions. Today, this Marian devotion remains a powerful weapon against evil and a means of obtaining graces. The example of the shepherd's sacrifice teaches us that suffering can be redemptive when offered to God. Jacinta and Francisco endured their illnesses with patience and joy, uniting themselves to the cross of Christ. The shepherd's love for the Eucharist is another aspect of their spirituality that should inspire the faithful. Francisco, in particular, wanted to remain constantly before Jesus in the tabernacle, adoring and consoling him. Jacinta lamented that so many people did not value Holy Mass and encouraged fervent participation in the Eucharist. Her example reminds us of the greatness of this sacrament, so often neglected. Devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, taught by Our Lady to the little shepherds, became one of the main messages of Fatima. Consecration to this maternal heart is a means of receiving protection and grace. Jacinta and Francisco understood that their mission was not only for themselves, but for all humanity. They therefore accepted everything God asked of them with love and generosity, becoming instruments of divine mercy. Their innocent hearts were capable of understanding profound truths of the faith that many adults do not grasp. Their lives were a true school of holiness for all who seek a closer relationship with God. The canonization of Francisco and Jacinta was the Church's recognition of their total surrender to God. The fact that they are the youngest non-martyr saints canonized shows that holiness is not tied to age, but to the disposition of the heart. The simplicity of their faith is a reminder that no theological knowledge or extraordinary achievements are necessary to please God. What He desires is a pure heart surrendered to His will. The story of the little shepherd saints invites us to a greater commitment to prayer and penance. Their example challenges us to live our faith with more love and dedication, regardless of the difficulties we may face. Today, when so many turn away from the faith and ignore God's calls, Francisco and Jacinta shine as beacons of light, reminding us of the importance of living a life oriented toward heaven. Their legacy teaches us that God continues to call simple people to be His witnesses. They were just children, yet their obedience to the divine will made them great saints of the Church. May the intercession of Saints Francisco and Jacinta help us to grow in holiness, to love God more, and to live the message of Fatima with greater fervor, putting Our Lady's requests into practice. May their examples of love, prayer, and sacrifice inspire us to seek God above all things, trusting that one day we may join them in the glory of heaven, beholding the radiant light of divine love.